So we're running live here, talking about value theory, theories of well-being. And are there any administrative issues that come to mind? Any content questions? I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. For those who are just joining, happy Thursday. Perhaps that's, for all intents and purposes, happy Friday to you as well. For those of you for whom that's not true, catch up with us tomorrow when it is. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. So we've been talking about some value theory, some theories of well-being. Remember, in a completed theory of value or completed value theory, more precisely, you're going to have a theory of well-being captured. There could be perfect overlap between the two. So you can imagine someone whose value theory, full stop, is just hedonism, and then they're also going to claim that that hedonism is the true theory of well-being. Okay, I wanted to scoot this over. Hang tight with me there. Okay, there we go. Okay. Good. All right. So again, just like big picture point that I'm sure you have well in mind, but just in case some of you don't, when you're thinking about a value theory, be thinking about theories of goodness and badness. And that's to be contrasted with thinking about normative theories, which are theories of rightness and wrongness. And we're focused there on right action, wrong action. We're talking about goodness and badness. We're typically talking about good or bad states of affairs or states of the world. Okay, so we got to a point where we were ready to do some critical evaluation. So we have the four main value theories or theories of well-being here on the slide: hedonism, desire satisfactionism, objective list theory, and perfectionism. So let's just talk about some challenges to them. Some challenges that aren't decisive, at least to many, but at least provide challenges to the view that would need to be responded to by those who endorse them, at the very least. So we have the hedonist view. So what's valuable for us, intrinsically speaking, is pleasant experiences, or having pleasant experiences. So a problem with the hedonist view, a traditional one, is a problem of bad pleasures. So the way this challenge would go is, imagine someone gets pleasure from doing something nefarious, say killing someone, murdering someone. So the pleasures derived from an action that would be considered bad, as we might say, immoral. Many are inclined to think that that hedonism gets the wrong result here, that the pleasant experience had by the murderer isn't good for the murderer. So this challenge seems to, if we're to think about it more generally, would be the source of the pleasant experience seems to matter. The source of the pleasure seems to matter. Was there a question? Okay, good. So that's just a challenge to hedonism to consider that a hedonist would have to respond to. And we'll discuss a possible response to that challenge later. Desire satisfactionism has a similar problem, the problem of bad or pointless desires. So these are distinct but related problems. So I just kind of group them together here. So suppose someone has a murderous desire. That desire is satisfied because the person in question who has a desire might murder someone. So like in the previous case, the previous challenge that we saw to hedonism, it looks like we have a case where the desire satisfactionist is going to say, oh, you've got intrinsic goodness. well-being promoted, perhaps, right, in that intrinsic way. But it looks like there's badness there because the desire results from a murder. A related problem is a problem of pointless desire. So there's a famous example of an individual who, for whatever reason, desires to count every blade of grass in his backyard. And he works at that, and then eventually is able to satisfy that desire. The desire satisfactionist is committed to saying, intrinsic goodness or well-being promoted. Intrinsic goodness, there's instanced in the world in that case. But many respond to that kind of case by thinking that that's the wrong result. It doesn't promote someone's well-being to have satisfied such pointless desires as counting every blade of grass in your backyard. And of course, you could multiply examples infinitely here, couldn't you? So that seems to be a problem for desire satisfactionism. It seems that maybe the general takeaway is that the quality of the desire matters, at least if we're to think about the nature of the objection. The quality of the desire, the quality of the object of desire, more accurately, seems to matter when we think about an individual's well-being being satisfied through the satisfaction of desires. So that's maybe the general takeaway there. Toward the end of today's discussion, I'll say some more about desire satisfactionism. In many ways, I'm just presenting some of the dominant themes from the Rush Schaefer Landau without following him programmatically and how he discusses these issues. So there's some overlap between my discussion and his. The focus of the first 4 chapters is hedonism, desire satisfactionism, and then challenges to those views. Okay, and then there's, remember, objective list theory. Remember, that view is, it's a view that different from the previous 2 views because it doesn't really sort of wear its content, right, and it's on its title, because you have to sort of try to understand what it means for a theory to be an objective list theory in the first place. But we know this is a pluralistic view of value or of well-being. So on this view, at least one of the items that are deemed good, intrinsically good for us, is objectively good. That's where the objective comes from. And then the view is listy. It's a list view just because there's nothing that, remember, non-trivially unifies what's deemed to be on the list of things that are intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. I say non-trivially again, just because trivially, every item that's on the list of things that are deemed intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us, they're unified by belonging to the list of things that are deemed to be intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. But that's uninteresting. So this view, remember, has the problem of arbitrariness, right? Given that there is no non-trivial unifier. So it seems like it's arbitrary what belongs to the list. Now, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that the objective list theorist can say. I just mentioned the fact that there's possible thought experiments that such theorists, objective list theorists, could invoke to determine what belongs on the list of things that are intrinsically good or deemed intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. But I didn't give any examples. One example that's in the literature that you would see if you were to survey it would be cases like the following. Imagine we have 2 individuals, individuals A and B, let's just call them, and individual A and B, they have exactly the same amount of pleasure, same quality of pleasures, if I can put it that way. So the amount and quality of pleasure is equivalent for both A and B. But then A and only A also has, let's say, knowledge, or yeah, let's just say has knowledge. We have to talk about amounts here, and then we ask, we step back and we ask, well, which of these individuals has greater levels of well-being? That might be one question we ask. And if the answer is A, because A has knowledge, then that's supposed to be like intuitive support for the claim that knowledge is also intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. We're thinking about the well-being case. And then you can imagine multiplying examples, right? So then you think, okay, now imagine A and B are identical with respect to pleasure and what they know, right? And then we ask, and then we consider the scenario in which A has, an amount of freedom, and just we leave the freedom out of the equation for B. And then we ask, well, which has greater levels of well-being, or where is there more intrinsic goodness exemplified? And many would say, oh, an A. And what explains that? Well, the only thing that could explain it is the fact that there's more freedom. So freedom gets included on our list of things that count as intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. You see how that would go? And then you can go next maybe with friendship, virtue more generally, right, et cetera, et cetera. So, we have an objective list here. It doesn't mean that, and they have the problem of arbitrariness, doesn't mean that that there's no method whatsoever in determining what belongs on the list of things that are intrinsically good. It's just that ultimately nothing really is going to unify them. Okay. Okay, so that's one method. I kind of issued a promissory note last time, and I cashed in on it here. Okay, now the problem with perfectionism, or remember the perfectionist view, right? That's the view that's traditionally pluralistic and objectivist. So what's good or what's intrinsically good for us holds independently of anybody caring about it, having interest in it, desiring it, taking pleasure in it, etc. So perfectionism, yeah, it's an objectivist view, traditionally pluralistic, just like objective list theory, but perfectionism doesn't require that, remember, logically. No matter what, though, however you end up working out perfectionism as an objectivist view, pluralistically or monistically, it's going to have the problem of perfection and the problem of human nature, fleshing out what perfection is or what it means to perfect human nature. But of course, you'd have to have an account of human nature worked out. So the problem is just working out accounts of perfection in human nature, and that's no small task. Any view that's put forward is going to be very contestable. Okay. Okay, so hopefully looking at some of these challenges helps with understanding the theories themselves. So some initial critical reflection. Now what I want to do is spend some time looking at a famous challenge to hedonism, a couple different famous challenges, as we work our way back to the experience machine argument. But I'm going to be strategic here and talk about an argument that's briefly mentioned by the Ruschafer-Landau. This is a famous challenge to hedonism. This challenge is the kind of challenge that traces all the way back to philosophers like Aristotle. So Aristotle, in one of his famous works called the Nicomachean Ethics, when faced with dealing with the hedonist worldview, or the hedonist view of goodness, argued that even though pleasure is something that is good, it's a theory ultimately fit for grazing animals, as he put it. Okay. And I think that the challenge here that I have noted, the swine argument, is basically a version of Aristotle's argument, just put using swine as opposed to grazing animals as this example. So for Aristotle, the claim that hedonism is a theory fit for grazing animals led him to say, what's really missing is like virtue. Virtue is the kind of thing that's significant to someone's life going well. And the way he would describe it is to someone flourishing, someone living excellently and flourishing in that regard. Now, there's debates about whether or not Aristotle was dealing with the same kind of issues, what counts as intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us, full stop, and whether or not he was concerned with some other question. No matter, we could just make the appropriate changes in thinking about the swine argument. So here's the basic idea behind the swine argument. It's like, look, if hedonism is true, then it looks like what's good for human beings, what's good for pigs, they're on a par with each other. The best human life, perhaps I could put it this way, in terms of well-being, is on a par with the best pig life, if I can put it that way. But again, in terms of well-being. And so I just flesh out the argument in premise, conclusion, form here, so we can see all the steps. So the swine argument would have step one: hedonism implies that what's good for humans is on a par with what's good for pigs, because it'd be pleasure in both cases. So of course, there's an assumption here that the hedonist would also claim that what's good for pigs is pleasure. But the hedonist is also making the claim that what's good for human beings, right, in terms of their well-being, is pleasure. So it's pleasure in both cases. So there's no room to say that one's better than the other. That's how you get the parity claim. But the swine argument's a challenge to hedonism. So step one just articulates an implication of hedonism. And step two is basically saying that what hedonism implies is false. And that would allow us to then conclude that hedonism itself is false, because if a theory implies something false, then it itself is false. The theory itself is false. Right? True theories, right, they imply true things. If a theory implies something false, then that's a dead giveaway that the theory is faulty, right? That's one of the ways in which we will test and challenge theories, is to see what their implications are. So step two is what's good for humans is better than what's good for pigs, right? In terms of like the well-being, in terms of our well-being, in terms of human well-being versus the well-being of pigs. And the classic claim here following Aristotle is that moral virtue is good for human beings. That's the classic claim. Now, the swine argument took place in the context of John Stuart Mill early on in a work called Utilitarianism that he wrote. He wants to defend hedonism. That may sound initially, paradoxical, but it's not, because he's considering it just a classic challenge to the view that he ultimately endorses, and he feels he needs to respond to it. And his response to it kicks off his version of hedonism. So John Stuart Mill wanted to defend hedonism. And the way he defends hedonism is by responding to this age-old objection to hedonism. And his response to this challenge kicks off his developed version of hedonism, which was different from many of the classical forms of the view. So there's John Stuart Mill. So it's his work, Utilitarianism, a pamphlet that he wrote designed to just capture what utilitarianism is. Those are his dates. He's a British philosopher, 19th century. He was a hedonistic utilitarian. That should be no surprise, given that I told you that he's a hedonist. He developed his version of hedonism. Whether or not he was a consistent one, that's another matter. But he was a hedonistic utilitarian. And what that dominantly means is that he defines happiness, with happiness of all, in terms of the pleasure of all. So happiness just is pleasure on his view. So think about utilitarianism, that normative view that tells us that the right thing to do in any circumstance, very roughly, is to promote the happiness of all, to maximize the happiness of all. Mill says, I can define what happiness is. It's just pleasure. And that makes him a hedonistic utilitarian, you see. He's also an empiricist, just to round things out here a little bit. Introduce some cool philosophy, some epistemology. This meant that Mill was part of that tradition, which was dominant in Great Britain in the 17th, 18th centuries, in particular, the rise of British empiricism. So that's a view that knowledge depends on sense experience. Knowledge depends on sense experience. So all the empiricists maintain that we have a rational faculty. It's just that reason, or the rational faculty, requires input from the senses to sort of operate on, as maybe an initial flat-footed way of understanding empiricism in its relationship to the rational faculty. And then he was a metaphysical naturalist. He thought that basically the natural sciences would determine what exists. He broke away from some of the metaphysical worldviews, which relied on just reason alone to determine what exists, or that relied on religious texts to determine what exists, etc. Sciences, the natural sciences will determine what exists. That's just to round things out with some Mill. He's one who we see the swine argument developed. He's one who developed the swine argument, just very, very briefly early on in utilitarianism. Okay. And he gave an infamous response to the argument, to the swine argument. He challenges the first premise, the first claim here. He accepts the second claim, and doesn't do so by following the Aristotelian claim, or the classic claim here, that moral virtue is intrinsically good for human beings. Virtue being a hedonist, he has to say that what's intrinsically good is only intrinsically good for us is pleasure only. So moral virtue would have to be not intrinsically good for us, but only, extrinsically good, right? So keep in mind, like, what it means to be a hedonist, right? It would mean that any other thing that's considered good besides pleasant experiences is only extrinsically good. So that's why I'm this parenthetical here. I just kind of know this is just a classic claim, and how this claim is classically defended. And we'll see how Mill defends it in a moment, because he does think that two is true. He just thinks that one is false. So hedonism then doesn't imply that the good for humans is on a par with what's good for pigs. Maybe a more accurate way of putting this would be like his newly developed version of hedonism, right? Doesn't imply that the good for humans is on a par with what's good for pigs. That makes sense? So it might be that some versions will imply this, but so much the worse for those versions of hedonism. All right, so that's a bit abstract. What he ends up claiming is that there are higher and lower pleasures. And only the humans can aim at the higher pleasures. Pigs and other animals, they can only aim at the lower pleasures. What are these? Well, the higher pleasures are moral pleasures, so the pleasures we get from acting morally. They're the aesthetic pleasures, the pleasures that we get from enjoying, the fine arts. And then there's the intellectual pleasures, the pleasures that we get from doing crossword puzzles and taking philosophy courses, going to college more generally, reading books, writing papers. And then the lower pleasures, those are just bodily pleasures or sensual pleasures. Okay, so for someone like Mill, he's gonna even say that for us, many of the bodily pleasures that we enjoy have a higher pleasure component, right? So the bodily pleasures are associated with, eating, drinking, enjoying sex and the like. There's an aesthetic component to those, right? But now remember, the aesthetic pleasures are among the higher ones, right? Oftentimes accompanying the aesthetic pleasures are intellectual pleasures, right? Think about when we sit down and enjoy a meal, oftentimes there are concepts behind the meal. Just to give like some simple examples, okay? So there's this important distinction between these pleasures where only humans can aim at the higher pleasures, but they can also aim at the lower ones, despite the fact that, as I've already mentioned, the lower pleasures typically have a higher pleasure component to them, at least for us. Whereas pigs, for example, they can only aim at the lower pleasures. The pigs don't care how the slop looks or how the food looks, right? They're not concerned with the plating of the food. Think about other animals in that regard too. Just to give kind of a simple example, and he claims that the higher pleasures are intrinsically better than. He uses expressions like the higher pleasures are superior to the lower ones. They're intrinsically better than. They are qualitatively superior than. And then he goes on to make claims like any amount of the higher pleasures is greater than any amount of the lower pleasures. Emphasis on the any. So he tries to define this intrinsic betterness, if I can put it that way, or this qualitative superiority in terms of quantitative claims. We understand the quantitative. So any amount, any quantity of the higher pleasures is superior to any amount, or greater than, superior to any amount of the lower pleasures. Sometimes this is called like a lexical superiority claim, but that's the claim that he makes. So, the pleasure that you might get from enjoying a paragraph from Dostoevsky, right? Or pick your favorite, novelist, compared to, a million units, pick your favorite lower pleasure. The paragraph that you enjoyed, the units of higher pleasures you get from enjoying that paragraph from Dostoevsky outweigh the million units of the lower pleasures. If we take, Mill very seriously here. So then we go back to this famous challenge to hedonism, the swine argument, that what Mill is going to say is that his hedonism doesn't imply that the good for humans is on a par with what's good for pigs, because what's good for humans involves enjoyment of the higher pleasures in addition to the lower ones. And what's good for the pigs is, as you've guessed it, maybe only the enjoyment of the lower pleasures. So given the qualitative superiority of the higher pleasures, we have a response to this first premise. It is pleasure in both cases, but the objection fails to recognize, as Mill might put it, the noble nature that human beings have over animals, the noble nature, the more dignified nature that human beings have, that affords them the capacity to enjoy the intellectual, the moral, and the aesthetic pleasures, the higher pleasures, you see? So then when Mill accepts 2, just to round things out here, isn't this fun? When Mill accepts 2, he's going to say what's good for humans is better than what's good for pigs, right? Based on his higher lower pleasure distinction, where goodness, what's good for us as human beings, is grounded in fundamentally, right, pleasure, the higher and the lower pleasures, you see? Moral virtue at this stage of the game for Mill, given his hedonism, it has to only be extrinsically good. It's only instrumentally good, and it's only instrumentally good when it contributes to pleasant experiences of the higher or lower kinds. That presumably would contribute to the higher kinds, because they're part of the higher pleasure grouping. Right? Part of the higher pleasures involves the moral pleasures we get from living morally, perhaps living morally virtuously. Okay, so that's the swine argument. And then Mill's infamous response. I say infamous response because there's a major problem with it traditionally. And the idea is that once a hedonist like Mill tries to say that some pleasures are lexically or qualitatively superior to other pleasures, then something has to account for the qualitative difference. Something has to account for the qualitative superiority of the higher pleasures over the lower ones. Something other than pleasure, ultimately. And now it looks like such a view is going to require that there be at least one other thing that's intrinsically good or intrinsically good for us. But now, once you take a hedonist view and you add something besides pleasure to it to account for what's intrinsically good for us, the theory is refuted. The theory falls apart. So the higher lower pleasure attempt to save hedonism from the swine argument, this long-standing objection, right, that Mill develops to hedonism, ends up resulting in its refutation. Because the higher lower pleasure distinction, as I know here on the slide, implies value pluralism. There's more than one thing that's intrinsically good. But hedonism is necessarily a version of value monism, remember? Now, you might just be wondering, like in the abstract, like what is it that Mill could have committed himself to without knowing it that counts as intrinsically valuable besides pleasure or pleasant experiences? And one candidate, the most viable candidate, is one that's already been noted, something about having maybe a rational nature which would correspond to that more noble, dignified nature that was discussed a few moments ago, that Mill claims that human beings have, that affords them the capacity to experience the higher pleasures, you see? So perhaps what Mill ends up developing, the higher lower pleasure distinction, is a view according to which pleasant experiences is intrinsically good for us, but also having a rational nature. When you think about the higher pleasures, they all seem to involve rationality. Intellectual pleasures, the moral pleasures, the aesthetic pleasures. So it's the pleasant experiences that are right, that are rational, right, in nature, that captures Mill's value theory, his theory of well-being, right? But now, right, what's also intrinsically valuable is having a rational nature, in addition to the pleasures, the pleasant experiences associated with them. Okay, so that's a major problem for Mill's version, anyways. So then this has led hedonists to have learned a great lesson, that you got to say that if you're going to be a hedonist, that all pleasures are on a qualitative par with each other. So Mill wanted to make pleasures heterogeneous, and then explain the heterogeneity in terms of qualitative superiority of one pleasure over another. one kind of pleasure over another kind of pleasure, more exactly. Okay. Couple of contemporary hedonists that may interest you. Ben Bradley, chair of the philosophy department at Syracuse University. I've already mentioned him once, but also a philosopher named Ben Bramble. I'll mention him later. So you'll have some references to him if you wanted to look him up. But he's someone who's trying to develop a contemporary version of hedonism, and it avoids Mill's infamous mistake. Okay, I've already noted this. A complete value theory provides a theory of well-being. That is, it provides a theory of what's intrinsically good for us, as opposed to just what's intrinsically good. And so I just kind of diagram this here so you have it. So there's what's good for us, and there's what's good, full stop. And a value theory is going to have both. But again, what's good for us could just be what's good, full stop. So in such views, you could just imagine there being an equal sign connecting these two. So just to flesh some of this out, one could be a hedonist about well-being, while being a pluralist, that is an objectivist theorist about value, just more generally. When they go that route, they would say something like justice, friendship, etc. Those things are intrinsically good, but they're only extrinsically good for us in terms of our well-being. That's how such a view might go. And hedonists about value, full stop, are also hedonists about well-being. Okay. So that'd be, the case of the perfect overlap, just an example, where the theory of what's good for us just overlaps completely with the theory of what's good, full stop. And of course, the intrinsically would need to be included. Okay. Okay, so now back to Nozick. So I kind of teased initially with the experience machine case, and then discussed some of the basics of value theory, theories of well-being, did some critical work, talked about now the Swine argument to hedonism. Now we're back to Nozick. It's going to turn out that Nozick's got a novel argument against hedonism. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this parenthetical for right now. Perhaps come back to it. Let's just focus on the response to hedonism so we don't overcomplicate things unnecessarily at this point. And that's the experience machine argument. So you're familiar with the experience machine case. But the experience machine case is designed to serve as an argument, or to help us think about formulating an argument against hedonism. So the argument has a similar structure to the Swine argument. You take hedonism and you think about what it implies, and if it implies something false, then you can reject hedonism. Same strategy here that Nozick takes. So hedonism implies that it's best for us in terms of our well-being to hook up to the experience machine. So if hedonism is true, then it's best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. This is just an implication claim. An if-then claim is just what we call a material implication claim in logic. The if part implies the then part. Okay. And then 2 is just saying that the then part is false. It isn't best in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. So then hedonism is false. It's the very same structure as the Swine argument against hedonism. So yeah, the big picture way of understanding this, if the if-then stuff throws you off initially, try to study this so it doesn't, but hedonism implies that it's best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. 2, but it isn't best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. So hedonism is false, because hedonism implies something false. So you see the then part here, it is best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine, is just negated in 2. 2 is just a negation, or the opposite, if I can put it that way, of the then part in 1. Okay. For the logicians out there, this is known as a modus tollens inference. Maybe some of you have taken some critical thinking or some logic. You don't have to memorize that. It's just for those of you who are interested in the logic here from 1 to 2 to 3. Okay. So this experience machine argument is applied to well-being hedonism. No surprise there. So just looking at the support for the premises here, in case it's just not clear to you, 1 and 2, they're premises in an argument, and 3, which the highlighted bit here is the conclusion. So arguments consist of premises and conclusions, where the premises, their job is or their function is to support conclusions. So we call 1 and 2 premises, we call 3 the conclusion. Many of you probably already know that, but in case some of you didn't, there you go. So 1 and 2, their premises they're supposed to support 3. And in this case, they perfectly support 3. The question is whether or not the premises are true. How do we know that the premises perfectly support 3? Just in terms of logical support, because we know the inference is perfect. The inference is modus tollens, and we know that that's a perfect, or we call it a valid argument form. Okay, where if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 also has to be true. But those are big ifs, so we need to test whether or not those premises are true. Okay. So premise 1, support for it's going to be the experience machine will guarantee pleasant experiences. Remember, there's a smorgasbord of experiences that you can select from that vast database, right, of experiences. And you could choose whatever experiences you wanted. Presumably, you're going to go for the ones you'd enjoy. Premise 2, it's better to, so remember, so premise 2 is claiming that it's not best in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. And support for that, this is Nozick's support for 2, is really twofold. I only have the second fold here. The first line of support is that we're going to, when we think about the experience machine case and we're asked whether we'd want to hook up to it, our inclination immediately is going to be, at least typically, no, we're not going to want to. There's going to be an immediate intuitive response that we wouldn't want to hook up to the experience machine. There's resistance to do so. And then what Nozick does is he tries to articulate what this resistance amounts to, right, in rational terms, as opposed to just relying on the initial intuition, the initial powerful judgment we have not to hook up. And so what he claims is that what explains this resistance has to do with the following 3 claims. 1, we think it's better to really do things, better in terms of our well-being, to really do things. And you wouldn't be really doing anything if you hook up to the experience machine, because you're having, remember, purely virtual experiences, not the veridical or genuine ones. So we think that it's better in terms of our well-being to really climb Everest, as opposed to only virtually do so, you see? We also think that it's better to develop our character than it is to hook up to the experience machine. The idea being that when you choose to hook up to the experience machine, you've in effect given up for the time that you hooked up to the experience machine on developing your character. The background idea here is just that developing our character requires there being some kind of resistance, some kind of external resistance. And the external resistance here is found in something like external world, right? Other people, and the natural world, perhaps a supernatural world. Okay. So developing our character requires interaction with an inflexible, in many cases, external world that we have to negotiate and figure out and work with, or even try to change. And then thirdly, we think it's better for us in terms of our well-being to engage with transcendent reality, or a humanly transcendent reality. The experience machine would be humanly made than it is to enjoy merely simulated experiences in an experience machine. The 2 kinds of transcendent realities, humanly transcendent realities that Nozick appeals to here, the natural reality which is here long before we were here, that we have to encounter, negotiate, et cetera, regularly, and the supernatural reality, if such a reality exists. So Nozick doesn't want to rule that out in his thinking here. So this would give some, who are theologically or religiously inclined, like reason to not hook up to the experience machine, right? They think it's better for them to have their connection with the divine or the supernatural. You hook up to the experience machine, you're not going to have that. The natural connection to natural reality is the clearer case, right? At least for some. But those who are getting religiously or theologically inclined, the transcendent point about the supernatural makes a lot of sense too. Okay. So keep in mind here, Nozick's not claiming that we can get better pleasures in reality compared to what we can get in the experience machine. So the claim isn't, you can get more and or better pleasures in reality than you would get if you hooked up to the experience machine. In fact, what we can do is we can understand, if we wanted, Nozick in the following way. Imagine we hold the pleasure facts fixed, or the pleasure quantities fixed. Take someone who hooks up for 5 years to the experience machine, right? And what we'll do is we'll say in those 5 years, we'll stipulate that individual gets 1,000 units of pleasure. And then we take someone else who has the same experiences, only they're genuine or they're veridical, and he also gets 1,000 units of pleasure. So we can fix the pleasure quantities accordingly. The idea is that, according to Nozick, in the second case, the fact that the individual really did things, really developed his character, really had contact with the humanly transcendent reality is better for him. Okay. So Nozick's claim that even if the experience machine can generate what reality does in terms of pleasure, as reality can offer, is what reality can offer, it is still better for us to really do things, to self-improve, to interact with human transcending things like nature and or the supernatural. So I'm taking the idea of developing our characters to involve, at least in part, self-improvement. Okay. Keep in mind that if Nozick were to be arguing that there are qualitatively better pleasures in reality than in the experience machine, then he would be evoking something akin to the higher lower pleasure distinction, just like Mill did, which was designed, remember, to defend hedonism, not challenge hedonism. Okay, and that distinction we saw failed, but keep in mind that it was used to defend, not refute hedonism. So Nozick's not trying to defend hedonism. He would be defending hedonism if he went on to say that, if he went on to run his argument to show that you can get more or better pleasures in reality than in the experience machine, right? That's certainly not his aim. It's to refute hedonism itself. Okay. So it might be thought that the problem with hedonism is its subjectivism. So then the question is, well, why do you think subjectivism is true? So there's a philosopher who's desire satisfaction. He's a subjectivist desire satisfaction theorist. His name is Chris Heathwood. And he gives us this Charlie case to try to motivate or to support subjectivism about well-being. Here's the Charlie case here. He says, Charlie wants to improve his quality of life. He has heard that it is philosophers who claim to be experts on this topic, so he looks through some philosophy journals at his library. He finds an article claiming to have discovered the correct account of welfare, well-being. So Heathwood uses the term welfare, where others use the term well-being. They mean the same thing. It's an objective theory that includes the items on our list above. Okay. The paper is in a pretty good journal, so Charlie decides to go about trying to increase his share of some of the items on the list. So maybe think about an objective list theory or perfectionist theory here as the theory that Charlie comes into contact with through his studies. For example, to increase his freedom, he moves to a state with higher speed limits. Charlie's careful to make sure that the move won't have any detrimental side effects, that it won't cause him to fail to get any less of the other goods on the list. After succeeding in increasing his freedom, Charlie finds that he doesn't care about it, that he's completely indifferent to it. Although he is free to drive faster, he never does. He never wants to, nor does the freedom to drive faster get him anything else that he is interested in. Charlie considers whether he is any better off in terms of his well-being. As a result of the increase in his freedom, he concludes that he's no better off. The question that Heathwood asks is, do you agree with Charlie's own assessment of his situation? I do. So the idea here is just supposed to be that Heathwood doesn't think that you can prove subjectivism is true, but a concrete case like this seems to lend quite a bit of support to a subjectivist view. That what's good for you in terms of your well-being has to be something that you care about. So Charlie, he tests this out. He tests out whether or not freedom is something that is intrinsically good for him in terms of his well-being by moving to a state where you can drive faster, thus exercise more of his freedom. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about exercising more of his freedom. So the fact that he's exercising his freedom, is able to, right, in this other state, doesn't seem to contribute to his well-being. The same thing could be run if we were to consider other examples. Suppose we were to discuss friendship or virtue. Suppose we modify the case to where Charlie increases his friendships. He becomes more virtuous, but he's, at the end of the day, just doesn't care about those things. Okay, the thought experiment is supposed to show, or the Charlie case is just supposed to show that caring about something is essential to whether or not it contributes to one's well-being. So that's a motivation for subjectivism, the Charlie case. So perhaps desire satisfactionism could come to the rescue here. So suppose you want to remain a subjectivist, but you realize that Nozick's experience machine was successful in refuting hedonism. Perhaps desire satisfactionism could help you. You can come to the rescue. Desire satisfactionism seems like it can explain why hooking up to Nozick's experience machine isn't best for us in terms of our well-being. Well, we don't want to hook up to it. That's, remember, the dominant, powerful judgment that we form when we're presented the experience machine case in the first place. So perhaps that's a route that one could go. But we still have the problem of murderous desires, don't we? And Heathwood gives us the example of Ted Bundy as a particular individual, a serial killer that many of you may know of. Okay, and what Heathwood claims in response, this will be the concluding point here, what Heathwood claims in response to to what we'll call the Ted Bundy case, the case of someone who had murderous desires and satisfied those desires, what Heathwood wants to claim is, look, in terms of Ted Bundy's well-being, he flourished. He flourished while he was murderous. But our judgment about the case is infected by our moral thinking, our normative moral thinking, more exactly. So what's true is that Ted Bundy was a moral monster. What he did was immoral. What he did was atrociously bad, morally speaking. But that's one kind of judgment. Another kind of judgment is whether or not Ted Bundy's well-being, right, was satisfied during the time that he was murderous, before he got caught and went to jail and all the rest, went to prison and all the rest, right? So what Heathwood says is we need to keep the normative judgments distinct from the value theory or the well-being judgments. We keep those separate from each other. And once we do, right, we can say that Ted Bundy's murderous desires, once satisfied, are good for him in terms of his well-being, but obviously they're atrociously wrong. They're seriously morally wrong. Okay. So perhaps desire satisfactionism has a response to the problem of murderous desires, and perhaps it's subjectivist view, that's better than the hedonist option. I said that was a concluding point, but I'll just raise one last thing and then I'll be quiet, I promise. What if someone does desire to hook up to the experience machine? What about that case? When you think about that case, it might turn out that that it's better for someone not to have that desire satisfied, right? If Nozick's right. And so the Nozick's argument could extend to desire satisfaction theory, right? And that's precisely what Ben Bramble, I told you I'd introduce him just very briefly. He argues in a paper called The Experience Machine in 2016, a very recent paper. He clarifies the scope of Nozick's argument and says it ranges over hedonism and desire satisfactionism. Imagine someone does desire to hook up to the experience machine. They do, right? Nozick's argument would, it seems, apply to desire satisfaction theory as well. And that would be a problem then for desire satisfaction theory, and a problem for this better, as we're claiming, subjectivist view, better than hedonism, at least given the experience machine challenge to hedonism that we discussed. But perhaps it's no better after all, because the experience machine argument may well just apply to desire satisfaction theory too. Okay. All right, any questions or comments? I know I've gone a couple minutes over here, so I'll be sure to stop now, but I'll take any questions, field any questions for a few minutes if there are any lingering. Okay, so if you're feeling good, then I'll go ahead and stop here. Have a great weekend. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you all next week. Take care, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.